The hissing steam of the locomotive announced its arrival in Cottonwood Springs, Texas, but Penelope Graham hardly noticed as she clutched the worn photograph in her trembling hand. The year was 1875, and she had traveled over 1,000 miles to marry a man she'd never met, a cowboy named Vincent Blackburn, who needed a wife as desperately as she needed a new beginning. She adjusted her high collar and the scarf that concealed the right side of her face before gathering her meager belongings. The weight of uncertainty pressed down on her shoulders as heavily as the scorching Texas sun. Last stop, Cottonwood Springs. The conductor called, his voice carrying over the noise of the engine. Penelope took a deep breath and stepped onto the platform. The small frontier town sprawled before her, dusty streets lined with wooden buildings, horses tied to hitching posts, and the distinct smell of livestock and dry earth hanging in the air. She scanned the faces of those waiting, searching for the tall figure described in his letters. Miss Graham. A deep voice spoke from behind her. She turned, her heart racing. Vincent Blackburn stood taller than she'd imagined from his letters, broad-shouldered with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of the Texas sky. His dark hair was partially hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and a week's worth of stubble shadowed his strong jaw. He wasn't handsome in the conventional way of Eastern gentlemen, but there was something undeniably compelling about him. Mr. Blackburn. She asked, quickly turning her scarred side away from his direct gaze. He nodded, removing his hat in a gesture of respect. Call me Vince, everyone does. His eyes lingered on her face for only a moment before he reached for her trunk. Journey treat you well. As well as could be expected, she replied softly, keeping her head angled. 4 days on a train is hardly comfortable. Vince loaded her trunk into a worn but well-maintained wagon. It's about an hour to the ranch from here. I figured you might want to rest before meeting everyone. He helped her onto the seat with a careful hand that spoke of strength tempered by gentleness. As they rode through the main street, Penelope felt the stares of the townspeople. She was accustomed to curious glances. The scarred side of her face had been drawing them since the fire 6 years ago, but these seemed different, more intrusive somehow. Mail order bride, a woman whispered loudly to her companion as they passed. Poor Blackburn, came another whisper. Must have been desperate to get sent damaged goods. Penelope stiffened, her fingers instinctively reaching to ensure her scarf was still in place. She had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that in this remote corner of Texas she might escape the cruelty she'd known back in Boston. Vince's jaw tightened and his knuckles turned white around the reins. He didn't speak until they had left the town behind, the wagon wheels kicking up dust on the open road. Don't mind them, he said finally. Small towns breed small minds. I'm used to it, she replied, though the words stung no less for their familiarity. Shouldn't have to be. His voice was low, almost a growl. Your letters didn't mention. The scars, she finished for him, her voice tight. Would you have still agreed to marry me if they had? Vince was quiet for a long moment, the only sounds the creak of the wagon and the steady plodding of the horse's hooves. I agreed to marry the woman who wrote those letters, thoughtful, intelligent, brave enough to cross a continent for a new life. Those things don't show on skin. Penelope studied his profile, trying to determine if he was simply being kind or truly meant it. The fire took my parents and our home, she said finally. It left me with nothing but these scars and painful memories, no prospects for marriage in Boston, no family to care for me. Well, you've got prospects now, he said simply. And as for family, there's me, my younger brother Patrick, and old Wallace, who's been with us since before our pa died. The road stretched ahead, winding through mesquite and scrub brush. In the distance, purple mountains broke the flat horizon. It's beautiful, Penelope breathed, momentarily forgetting her self-consciousness. It can be harsh, Vince warned. Drought, dust storms, bandits, cattle rustlers, but there's freedom here like nowhere else. As they approached the ranch, Penelope saw a modest but well-built house, a large barn, and several outbuildings. A windmill turned lazily in the afternoon breeze, and cattle dotted the distant pastures. Welcome to the Rocking Bee, Vince said. It ain't much compared to Boston, but it's home. It's more than I've had in years, she admitted. Two figures emerged from the house as the wagon approached a younger man who bore a striking resemblance to Vince and an older man with a weathered face. "That's Patrick and Wallace," Vince explained. "They've been fixing up the old cabin for us. Thought you might want your own space until we're properly married." The thoughtfulness of the gesture brought unexpected tears to Penelope's eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. As Vince helped her down from the wagon, Patrick bounded forward with an easy smile. "So you're the Boston lady who's finally going to civilize my brother? I'm Patrick, and I have to say, your letters made you sound smart enough to know better than to marry this grumpy cowhand." "Patrick," Vince warned, but Penelope found herself smiling despite her nerves. "I'm Penelope," she said, carefully keeping her scarred side turned away. "It's a pleasure to meet you." Wallace approached more slowly, his roomy eyes kind beneath bushy white brows. "Miss Penelope," he greeted with a slight bow, "we've got stew on for supper and fresh bread baked this morning. Figured you might be hungry after your journey." "That sounds wonderful," she said gratefully. As they walked toward the house, Penelope was acutely aware of Patrick's curious glance when she turned her head and he caught sight of her scars. To his credit, he showed no reaction beyond a moment's surprise. The cabin they'd prepared for her was small but clean, with fresh curtains at the windows and wildflowers in a jar on the table. A proper bed with a colorful quilt stood in one corner and a washstand with a pitcher and bowl in another. "It's not fancy," Vince said, setting down her trunk. "But it's private. The house is just up the path." Supper in an hour. When he'd gone, Penelope sank onto the bed, emotions overwhelming her. She'd traveled so far, risked so much on this chance at a new life. Vincent Blackburn seemed decent enough, but would he truly accept her once he saw the full extent of her scars? Would his kindness last beyond the novelty of her arrival? She unpacked her few belongings, changed into a fresh dress, and carefully rewrapped her scarf before making her way to the main house. The aroma of beef stew and fresh bread greeted her, along with the gentle rumble of male voices. The conversation halted briefly as she entered, then resumed as Vince pulled out a chair for her at the rough-hewn table. Wallace served the stew while Patrick cut thick slices of bread. "Miss Penelope," Wallace said, "Vince tells us you were a schoolteacher back east." "Yes, for a time," she replied, relieved at the ordinary topic. "I taught mostly young children reading, writing, basic arithmetic. We could use a proper schoolteacher in Cottonwood Springs," Patrick remarked. "Pastor Williams tries his best, but he's spread thin with church duties." "I hadn't considered teaching here," Penelope admitted. "I thought perhaps I'd be too busy with ranch duties." Vince looked up from his stew. "You should teach if you want to. Town's growing, lots of families moving in. Children need learning." His simple statement of support warmed something inside her. The meal continued with easy conversation about the ranch, the town, and the upcoming cattle drive Vince would lead in 2 weeks. "You'll be gone?" Penelope asked, trying to mask her alarm at the thought of being left so soon after her arrival. 10 days, maybe 2 weeks, Vince confirmed. "Patrick and Wallace will be here, and Mrs. Winters from the neighboring ranch said she'd stop by to check on you." After supper, Vince walked her back to the cabin as darkness fell across the land. The stars emerged in brilliant clarity, more than Penelope had ever seen in Boston's smoke-filled skies. "They're magnificent," she breathed, staring upward. Vince followed her gaze. "One thing about Texas sky goes on forever." At her door, he hesitated. "The Reverend can marry us Sunday after services if that suits you, or we can wait longer if you need time." Penelope considered the question carefully. They were virtual strangers, yet she had come all this way to be his wife. "Sunday would be fine," she said finally. "If you're still certain after seeing—" She gestured vaguely toward her face in the silver moonlight. Vince's expression was solemn. "I meant what I said earlier. But if you've got doubts about me, we can wait." "No," she said quickly. "No doubts, just fear, I suppose. It's been a long time since I've allowed myself to hope for anything." "Hope's about all we've got out here sometimes," he replied. "That and grit." He tipped his hat. "Sleep well, Penelope. Tomorrow I'll show you the ranch proper." The days before Sunday passed in a blur of new experiences. Vince showed her the operations of the ranch, introduced her to the hands, and even taught her to ride properly, something she'd never learned in Boston. He was patient but not condescending, firm but never harsh. Each evening he walked her to her cabin door, bid her good night with a tip of his hat, and left her with growing curiosity about the man she was about to marry. On Saturday evening, Penelope steeled herself for what she knew had to be done. Vince deserved to know exactly what he was committing to before they stood before the reverend. When he arrived to escort her to supper, she asked him to wait inside the cabin for a moment. "There's something I need to show you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Before tomorrow." Vince nodded, his expression unreadable as he entered and closed the door behind him. With shaking fingers, Penelope unwound the scarf and turned to face him fully for the first time. The scars ran from her right temple down her cheek and neck, disappearing beneath her high collar, puckered, reddened skin that pulled at the corner of her eye and mouth. "This is me," she said simply, fighting the urge to cover herself again. "All of me." Vince's eyes moved slowly over her face, taking in every detail of the scarring. Then, to her astonishment, he reached out and gently traced the line where damaged skin met smooth with his calloused fingertip. "You're beautiful," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Brave, too. Life tried to break you, but here you stand." Tears filled Penelope's eyes at his words. "You truly don't mind." He shook his head slowly. "Penelope, everyone in the West carries scars, some are just more visible than others." He gestured to a long white scar on his forearm. "Barbed wire." Then to another at his temple, partially hidden by his hair. "Bar fight in Abilene." Finally, he placed his hand over his heart. "And some you can't see at all." In that moment, something shifted between them, understanding, acceptance, the beginnings of something that might one day be love. Sunday dawned clear and hot. Penelope dressed in her best gown, a dove-gray silk with pearl buttons that had belonged to her mother. She left her scarf behind, instead arranging her hair to partially cover the worst of the scarring. It wasn't concealment, she told herself, but compromise. The journey to town was tense with anticipation. Vince wore a clean black suit that strained slightly at his broad shoulders, and he'd trimmed his beard and slicked back his hair. He looked handsome and uncomfortable in equal measure. "You clean up well, Mr. Blackburn," she teased gently, trying to ease the tension. He tugged at his collar. "Feel like I'm being strangled, but Patrick says a man ought to suffer a bit for his wedding day." The small white church at the edge of town was already filled with curious townsfolk when they arrived. Penelope felt their stares as she walked in on Vince's arm, her scars visible to all. "That's her," someone whispered. "The mail-order bride with the ruined face." "Lord have mercy," muttered another. "Blackburn must be desperate indeed." Vince's arm tightened around hers. He leaned down to whisper in her ear, "Remember what I told you, small minds." The ceremony was brief but meaningful. Reverend Williams spoke of partnership, of facing life's trials together, of building something lasting in a land that tried to tear down everything man created. When Vince spoke his vows, his voice was steady and sure. When Penelope spoke hers, she found strength in his unwavering gaze. As they exited the church as husband and wife, the whispers continued. A group of young women stood to one side, their faces masks of pity and barely concealed disdain. "Poor thing," one said loudly enough to be heard, "to be so marked and have to travel all this way just to find a man." "I hear she paid him," said another with a cruel laugh. "No man would take damaged goods otherwise." Vince stopped abruptly, his body tensing. Before Penelope could restrain him, he turned to face the whisperers, his eyes cold as the Texas sky in winter. "My wife," he said, his voice carrying across the churchyard, "is worth 100 of you. Mock her scars again, and they'll fear my wrath tonight." The absolute certainty in his voice silenced the crowd. He took Penelope's arm again and led her to the wagon with dignified calm, but she could feel the fury radiating from him. "I apologize," he said once they were seated. "Shouldn't have caused a scene at our wedding." "No one has ever defended me like that," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." His expression softened as he looked at her. "You're my wife now, that means something out here." The wedding celebration at the ranch was a small affair, just Patrick Wallace and a few of the hands. Mrs. Winters from the neighboring ranch brought a cake, and someone produced a fiddle. There was dancing in the yard as the sun set, casting long shadows across the Texas earth. When Vince took Penelope in his arms for a dance, his touch was respectful, almost hesitant. "Never was much of a dancer," he admitted. "Then we'll learn together," she replied, placing her scarred cheek against his chest. As darkness fell, the celebration wound down. The moment Penelope had both anticipated and dreaded approached the wedding night. By custom and law, she was now Vince's wife in name, but not yet in fact. To her surprise, he walked her not to the main house but back to her cabin. "I had Wallace move my things to the house," he explained, seeing her confusion. "Figured you might want your own space a while longer. Until we know each other better." Relief and something like disappointment mingled in Penelope's chest. "You're a good man, Vincent Blackburn." He ducked his head, clearly uncomfortable with the praise. "Just trying to do right by you." He hesitated, then leaned down to press a gentle kiss to her forehead, not her lips, not yet. "Good night, Mrs. Blackburn." That night, alone in her cabin, Penelope traced her fingers over her scars and allowed herself to imagine a future where they didn't define her, a future with this quiet, honorable man who saw beyond them to the person beneath. The days following the wedding settled into a rhythm. Penelope learned the workings of the ranch house, worked alongside Wallace in the kitchen, and began to feel useful again. Vince was often gone from dawn until dusk, working with the cattle and preparing for the upcoming drive, but the evenings were theirs. They would sit on the porch of the main house, talking as the stars emerged. She learned about his childhood on the ranch, his parents' deaths from fever when he was 17, leaving him to raise Patrick and run the ranch. He learned about her life in Boston, her teaching, the fire that took everything. "I was trapped," she told him one evening. "My father went back for my mother, neither made it out. A neighbor pulled me through a window, but not before." She gestured to her face. "The doctors said I was lucky to keep my eye my life." "Didn't feel lucky, I expect," Vince said quietly. "No," she admitted. "Not for a long time." Their conversations gradually built a foundation of understanding, of mutual respect. Each night ended the same way, a gentle kiss to her forehead, "Good night, Mrs. Blackburn," and separate beds. Penelope began to wonder if he would ever want more. A week after their wedding, Vince took her into town to discuss the possibility of her teaching. The school board, consisting of Reverend Williams, the mayor, and two prominent ranchers, agreed to a trial period of 3 months, starting after Vince returned from the cattle drive. As they walked from the meeting, Penelope felt eyes on them once again. The same group of young women from the church stood outside the general store watching their approach. "Mrs. Blackburn," one called with false sweetness, "how lovely to see you. We were just saying how brave you are to be out in public with your condition." Vince tensed beside her, but Penelope placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Thank you for your concern," she said calmly, "but I assure you, my condition doesn't prevent me from living a full life, including teaching your children, should you have any." The woman's face flushed with embarrassment. As they walked away, Penelope felt a small surge of triumph. For the first time in years, she had defended herself instead of hiding. "You didn't need my wrath after all," Vince said with a hint of pride in his voice. "Perhaps not," she agreed, "but knowing it was there gave me courage." The night before Vince was to leave for the cattle drive, Penelope prepared a special dinner, his favorite beef stew, fresh bread, and an apple pie she'd learned to make from Wallace. As they ate, she noticed Vince watching her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "What is it?" she asked finally. "Just thinking how different this place feels with you here," he said. "Better, like it's finally a home again, not just a ranch." "I've tried to make myself useful," she replied, oddly pleased by his observation. "It's not about useful." He set down his fork, searching for words. "It's about belonging. You belong here, Penelope, with us, with me." The simplicity of his statement touched something deep within her. "I feel that too," she admitted softly. After dinner, they sat on the porch as usual, but tonight there was a tension in the air, an unspoken question hovering between them. When Vince finally stood to bid her goodnight, Penelope gathered her courage. "I don't want to sleep in the cabin tonight," she said, her voice barely audible. Vince went very still. "Penelope, I know what I'm asking, she interrupted. We're married, Vince. You've been more patient, more respectful than any woman could hope for. But I don't want to spend another night alone, especially not with you leaving tomorrow. In the silver moonlight, she watched emotions cross his face: desire, concern, uncertainty. Are you sure? He asked finally. I never wanted you to feel rushed or obligated. In answer, Penelope rose and took his hand, leading him toward the main house. Inside, the bedroom was simply furnished: a large bed with a patchwork quilt, a chest of drawers, a washstand with a basin and pitcher. A single lamp burned low on the bedside table. Standing in the dim light, Penelope began to unbutton her dress, her fingers trembling slightly. Vince watched, transfixed, as the fabric parted to reveal more of her scarred skin. The damage continued down her neck, across her right shoulder and upper arm, a permanent reminder of that terrible night. The fire took more than my face, she said, her voice steady despite her fear. If this changes things, nothing could change things, Vince said hoarsely. He crossed to her in 2 long strides, his hands gently framing her face, both the smooth side and the scarred. You're beautiful, Penelope, every inch of you. When his lips finally met hers, it was with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. The kiss deepened slowly, speaking of patience and promise. That night, Vince showed her with every touch, every whispered word, that her scars were simply part of her, neither defining nor diminishing the woman he was growing to love. In the pre-dawn darkness, Penelope woke to find Vince already dressed, sitting on the edge of the bed watching her. I didn't want to wake you, he said softly. I'm glad you did. She sat up, holding the quilt to her chest. I want to say goodbye properly. His hand cupped her cheek, thumb tracing the line of her jaw. 2 weeks, 3 at most, Patrick and Wallace will look after you. And I'll look after them, she promised. Be safe, Vince. His kiss was lingering, reluctant. You've given me something to come home to, Penelope Blackburn. After he had gone, Penelope dressed and went to the kitchen, determined to keep busy. The house felt emptier without Vince's solid presence, but there was comfort in knowing this was temporary, that he would return, that this was now her home, her life. The days of Vince's absence stretched into a week, then 2. Penelope established a routine, helping Wallace with meals, tending the kitchen garden, assisting Patrick with bookkeeping for the ranch. She began preparing lessons for her teaching position, ordering books from catalogs, and converting an unused storeroom in the house into a study. Occasionally, she ventured into town for supplies, bearing the stares and whispers with increasing confidence. Mrs. Winters visited regularly, bringing gossip from neighboring ranches and practical advice on ranch life. Slowly, Penelope began to feel part of the community, scars and all. At night, she slept in the bed she had shared with Vince, drawing comfort from his lingering scent on the pillow. She wrote in her journal about her new life, her growing feelings for her husband, her hopes for their future together. For the first time in years, those hopes didn't seem like distant dreams but achievable realities. It was during the 3rd week of Vince's absence that trouble arrived at the Rocking Bee. Penelope was hanging laundry when she heard horses approaching, too many for it to be Vince returning. Patrick emerged from the barn, rifle in hand, as 5 riders came into view. Stay back, Penelope, he called, moving to stand between her and the approaching men. The riders reined in their horses in the yard, dust swirling around their legs. The leader was a heavy-set man with a bushy beard and cold eyes. Beside him sat a familiar face, one of the women who had mocked Penelope outside the general store. Well now, young Blackburn, the man drawled, is your brother around? He's due back any day, Patrick replied, rifle held casually but ready. Something I can help you with, Jenkins? Matter of fact, there is. Jenkins dismounted, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. My daughter Lucinda here tells me your brother's gone and married himself a circus freak from back east. Penelope stiffened at the cruel words but held her ground. That's my sister-in-law you're talking about, Patrick said, his voice dangerous. I suggest you watch your tongue on Blackburn land. Jenkins laughed, an ugly sound. Blackburn land, is it? Funny you should mention that. He pulled a folded paper from inside his vest. See, I've been talking to the bank in Austin. Seems your brother took out a loan last year that's coming due. Bank's willing to sell the note to me for the right price. Penelope glanced at Patrick, saw the flicker of concern cross his face before he masked it. Vince has the payment ready, he said with more confidence than he clearly felt. He'll settle it when he returns with the cattle money. Maybe, Jenkins conceded, refolding the paper. Or maybe something happens to that herd. Rustlers are bad this season, or maybe the bank gets impatient. His gaze shifted to Penelope, lingering on her scars with undisguised disgust. I'll tell you what, though. I'm willing to forget the whole thing if your brother reconsiders his situation. My Lucinda here would make a fine rancher's wife, and she's got a whole face to boot. Fury rose in Penelope, burning away her fear. She stepped forward, ignoring Patrick's warning look. Mr. Jenkins, she said clearly, I am Mrs. Vincent Blackburn, legal wife and partner to the owner of this ranch. Whatever business you have with my husband can wait for his return. Until then, I'll thank you to leave our property. Jenkins' face darkened with anger. You uppity little, that's enough, came Wallace's voice from the porch. The old man stood with a shotgun braced against his shoulder. Miss Penelope asked you polite to leave. I'm not feeling so polite myself. For a tense moment, Penelope thought Jenkins might do something rash. Then he spat again and remounted his horse. This ain't over, he warned. You tell Blackburn I'll be seeing him. As they rode away, Penelope's knees nearly buckled with delayed fear. Patrick steadied her with a hand on her arm. You stood up to them, he said, something like awe in his voice. I've never seen a woman face down Jenkins like that. I've faced worse than him, she replied, thinking of the years of cruelty in Boston. Vince should be home soon, Wallace said, joining them, but we should be ready in case Jenkins tries something before then. That night, Penelope lay awake, worry gnawing at her. What if Jenkins was right about the loan? What if something happened to Vince or the herd? The ranch could be lost, and it would be partially her fault. Vince had mentioned using some of the cattle money for improvements, which she now suspected included her teaching supplies and the modifications to the study. Her fears deepened when Patrick reluctantly confirmed that Vince had indeed taken a loan to keep the ranch going through the previous winter's harsh weather. But the cattle drive will more than cover it, he assured her. Jenkins is just trying to scare us. 3 days later, with still no sign of Vince, Jenkins returned this time with the local sheriff. Mrs. Blackburn, the sheriff said, removing his hat politely. I'm afraid I've got some official business. Mr. Jenkins here has purchased your husband's banknote and is demanding immediate payment. That's impossible, Patrick protested. The bank can't sell without notifying us first. The sheriff looked uncomfortable. Normally, that's true. But the terms of this particular note allow for transfer at the bank's discretion. Jenkins smirked triumphantly. $5,000 by week's end or the ranch is mine. 5,000? Patrick exclaimed. The note was for 3, interest, Jenkins said with a shrug, plus fees. After they had gone, Penelope, Patrick, and Wallace gathered around the kitchen table to assess their situation. The ranch had some money set aside, but nowhere near $5,000. Everything depended on Vince returning with the cattle money in time. We could try to get a loan from another bank, Patrick suggested. No bank around here will cross Jenkins, Wallace said grimly. He's got too many friends in high places. Penelope thought of her meager savings brought from Boston. I have about $200, she offered. It's not much, but keep it, Patrick said firmly. Vince will be back. He has to be. The next day, Penelope rode into town with Patrick. If they couldn't raise the money, perhaps they could at least buy more time. The town lawyer, a kindly older man named Mr. Franklin, listened to their story with growing concern. Jenkins has been trying to get his hands on Rocking Bee for years, he explained. Your land has the best water access in the county. I'm afraid if he's gone to these lengths, he won't be easily deterred. There must be something we can do, Penelope insisted. Mr. Franklin studied her thoughtfully. There might be. The note was issued to Vincent Blackburn specifically, not to the Blackburn family. He turned to a large law book on his shelf. According to Texas property law, a wife has certain rights to property brought into or acquired during a marriage. Hope flickered in Penelope's chest. Meaning, the lawyer said. That Jenkins can't legally seize the ranch without your consent, Mrs. Blackburn, regardless of the note. He can bring suit against your husband for the money, but the property itself is at least partially protected by your marital rights. It wasn't a solution, but it was a delay, and delay was what they needed most. When they returned to the ranch, 3 riders were approaching from the east. Penelope's heart leapt, thinking it might be Vince, but Patrick's curse told her otherwise. "Jenkins again," he muttered. "And looks like he's brought friends." This time, Jenkins didn't bother with pleasantries. "Got a proposition for you, Mrs. Blackburn," he called as they rode into the yard. "Sign over your rights to this property, and I'll let you and the boy here stay on his hands, old Wallace too." "That's very generous," Penelope replied coldly, "but I'm afraid I must decline." Jenkins' face darkened. "Then I'll just have to convince you." He nodded to his companions. "Burn the barn." Before Patrick could raise his rifle, one of Jenkins' men fired a warning shot into the air. "I wouldn't, boy, not unless you want to join your brother." Penelope's blood ran cold. "What do you mean? Where's Vince?" Jenkins smiled, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "Let's just say he ran into some trouble on the trail. Rustlers are mighty dangerous this time of year." "You're lying," Patrick said, but his voice betrayed his fear. "Am I?" Jenkins reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a familiar object, Vince's hat, with its distinctive band of braided leather Penelope had made for him before he left. "Found this with what was left of his herd." "Shame about the cattle, and your brother." Grief and horror threatened to overwhelm Penelope, but something in Jenkins' smug expression made her doubt. Would he really admit to murder in front of witnesses? Or was this another tactic to force their compliance? "If you've harmed my husband," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "the law will see you hang." Jenkins laughed. "Prove it." He tossed Vince's hat into the dirt at her feet. "You've got 1 day to clear out, or we burn it all, starting with you, Scarface." As they rode away, Patrick retrieved the hat, his face ashen. "This is Vince's," he confirmed. "But that doesn't mean he could have lost it or been forced to give it up. Or Jenkins could be telling the truth," Wallace said heavily. Penelope took the hat from Patrick's hands, running her fingers over the band she had braided. "No," she said firmly. "Vince is alive, I can feel it, and we're not leaving this ranch, not to Jenkins, not to anyone." That night they prepared as best they could for whatever might come. Patrick and Wallace cleaned their rifles and positioned ammunition around the house. Penelope filled every available container with water in case the well was compromised and cooked enough food to last several days. As darkness fell, she sat on the porch, Vince's hat in her lap, watching the road. "Come back to me," she whispered to the night. "Please, Vince, I need you." The attack came just before dawn, not with gunfire as they'd expected, but with flames. Penelope woke to the smell of smoke and Patrick's shout of alarm. The barn was ablaze, orange flames licking at the night sky. "The horses," she cried, throwing on her robe. "No time," Wallace said, pulling her toward the door. "They're already loose, but they've set fires around the house too." Outside, Penelope could see dark figures moving in the pre-dawn light, torches in hand. The smell of kerosene was strong on the wind. "Get to the root cellar," Patrick ordered, rifle in hand. "Its stone fire can't reach you there." "I won't hide while you fight," Penelope protested. A shot rang out, splintering the porch railing beside her. Wallace shoved her down as more bullets followed. "Go," he shouted. "We'll hold them off." Reluctantly, Penelope crawled toward the back of the house, keeping low. The root cellar was a small stone structure built into a hillside behind the house, cool, dark, and hopefully safe from both fire and bullets. She had just reached the cellar doors when she heard hoofbeats, many horses, approaching fast from the west. More of Jenkins' men. Or perhaps the sheriff, finally doing his duty, voices shouted, more gunshots rang out, and then impossibly she heard a voice that stopped her heart. "Jenkins!" The roar carried across the ranch yard, powerful and familiar. "Face me, you coward, Vince." Penelope scrambled to her feet, heedless of danger, and ran toward the sound of his voice. In the growing light of dawn, she saw him astride a lathered horse, dusty and trail-worn but gloriously, wonderfully alive. Behind him rode at least 20 cowboys, rifles drawn. Jenkins and his men were caught by surprise, surrounded before they could mount an effective defense. Patrick and Wallace emerged from their positions, adding their rifles to the overwhelming force Vince had brought. When Penelope reached him, Vince swung down from his horse and caught her in his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe, but she didn't care. "They said you were dead," she sobbed against his chest. "Jenkins had your hat, lost it in a creek crossing," Vince explained, his voice rough with emotion. "We were delayed by a flash flood, lost some cattle, then we ran into Jenkins' men watching the trail, figured something was wrong, so we gathered some help from other outfits heading to market." Over his shoulder, Penelope saw Jenkins and his men being tied up by Vince's cowboys. The sheriff had arrived as well, looking decidedly uncomfortable as he took in the scene. "Sheriff," Vince called, keeping one arm firmly around Penelope. "You'll find these men guilty of arson, attempted murder, and cattle rustling. We caught them driving some of my branded steers yesterday." The sheriff couldn't meet Vince's eyes. "I'll see they face charges, Blackburn. And I'll see the governor hears about your involvement," Vince added coldly. "Taking bribes from Jenkins to look the other way. That badge won't protect you for long." As dawn broke fully across the ranch, the fires were extinguished, the prisoners taken away, and the damage assessed. The barn would need rebuilding, but the house was largely untouched. Most importantly, everyone was safe, and Vince had returned with enough cattle money to pay off the loan and have plenty left over. That evening, after the chaos had subsided, and the last of Vince's cowboy allies had departed with thanks and promises of future help if needed, Penelope and Vince sat on the porch steps, watching the stars emerge. "When I heard Jenkins claim you were dead," Penelope said softly, "I thought my heart would stop, but something in me refused to believe it." Vince's arm tightened around her shoulders. "I felt the same crossing that flooded creek. All I could think was getting back to you, making sure you were safe." He turned to face her, his expression serious in the fading light. "I've never been good with words, Penelope, but I need you to know I love you. Not just as my wife, not just as the brave woman who stood against Jenkins to protect our home. I love you, scars and all, for exactly who you are." Tears filled Penelope's eyes as she reached up to touch his face. "And I love you, Vincent Blackburn. You saw me when no one else would look. You gave me a home when I had nothing. You gave me courage when I'd forgotten what it felt like." His kiss was tender, a promise of all the days to come. When they finally broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers. "What do you say we rebuild that barn, get the school set up in town, and start thinking about filling this house with children?" "I'd say that sounds like the perfect beginning," Penelope replied, smiling through her tears. Over the weeks and months that followed, word of the showdown at the Rocking Bees spread throughout the county. The tale grew, with each telling how the scarred mail-order bride had defied Jenkins, how Vincent Blackburn had returned just in time with an army of cowboys, how the corrupt sheriff had been replaced with a former Texas Ranger who believed in justice for all. The barn was rebuilt with the help of neighboring ranchers. Penelope began teaching in a small schoolhouse in town, earning the respect of parents and the adoration of children who soon forgot to notice her scars in their excitement for learning. Jenkins and his men were tried and sentenced to prison for their crimes, but perhaps the most significant change was in the town's attitude toward Penelope. The whispers and stares gradually gave way to genuine smiles and greetings. The women who had once mocked her now sought her advice on household matters or educational concerns for their children. It wasn't universal acceptance, some still looked away from her scarred face, but it was progress. 1 year after Penelope's arrival in Texas, she and Vince held a celebration at the ranch, part anniversary, part harvest festival, and part housewarming for the expanded ranch house with its new nursery. Penelope was 4 months pregnant, her condition just beginning to show beneath her dress. As guests mingled in the yard, eating barbecue and dancing to fiddle music, Reverend Williams approached Penelope with a somewhat sheepish expression. "Mrs. Blackburn," he began, "I owe you an apology. When you first arrived, I admit I had doubts about your marriage to Vincent. I feared he had made a hasty decision that both of you might come to regret." Penelope smiled, watching as Vince demonstrated roping techniques to a group of admiring children. "And now, Reverend," the older man followed her gaze, Now I believe your marriage was meant by Providence. You've brought life and learning to our community, and I've never seen Vincent Blackburn so content. Nor have I ever been so happy, Penelope replied honestly. My scars led me here in a way. Without them, I might never have left Boston, never found Vince or this life. Later, as the celebration continued under the stars, Vince led Penelope away from the crowd, down to the small creek that ran along the edge of their property. In the moonlight, the water glimmered like silver, and the night was alive with the sounds of crickets and distant laughter. Remember what I said that day outside the church? Vince asked, his arms encircling her from behind, hands resting gently on her growing belly. Then they'll fear my wrath tonight, Penelope quoted with a soft laugh. Rather dramatic, Vince chuckled, the sound rumbling against her back. Maybe, but I meant it. I'd still do anything to protect you, Penelope, you and our child. She turned in his arms to face him. I know. But what I've learned this past year is that sometimes the greatest protection isn't in fighting battles for someone, it's in giving them the strength to face their own. You always had that strength, Vince said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers gently tracing the line of her scars. I just reminded you it was there. Above them, a shooting star blazed across the Texas sky, a brief, brilliant moment of beauty in the darkness. Make a wish, Vince whispered. Penelope smiled up at him, her scarred face radiant with happiness. I don't need to, she said simply. I already have everything I could wish for. In the years that followed, the legend of the scarred mail-order bride and her devoted cowboy became part of local folklore. Their children, 3 boys and a girl, grew up hearing how their father had defended their mother's honor, how their mother had stood against cattle rustlers and corrupt officials, how love had transformed both scars and a lonely ranch into something beautiful. The Rocking Bee prospered under their care, becoming one of the most respected ranches in the county. Penelope's school grew into a proper academy that drew students from miles around. Vince served as county commissioner for 2 terms, working to ensure fair treatment for all ranchers regardless of size or influence. And every year on their anniversary, Vince would present Penelope with a single wildflower, a reminder of the simple blooms he had placed in her cabin on that first day of her arrival. It was his way of saying that beauty could be found in unexpected places, that hope could bloom even in the harshest conditions, and that some loves were worth crossing a continent to find. In a land where survival often depended on strength and grit, Penelope and Vince Blackburn had discovered that the greatest strength came from acceptance of each other, of their pasts, of the scars both visible and hidden that had shaped them into the people they had become. Together, they had built something that would outlast them both, not just a ranch or a family, but a legacy of courage, compassion, and love that transformed not only their lives but the very community around them. And when people spoke of them in later years, it was never as the scarred woman and her cowboy, but simply as the Blackburns, a family whose love had become as much a part of the Texas landscape as the endless sky and the eternal stars that watched over them all.